Most of the minerals needed for the clean energy transition are on tribal lands. A century ago, that meant companies just stole the resource. Now it's a much more complicated dance that includes respect for indigenous governance. More about that on Breaking History. Hey, Mark Trahant here, and we're back with another edition of Breaking History. Before we go on, do me a favor and click the subscribe button, and be sure to share and comment. It wasn't all that long ago that natural resource development on tribal lands worked like this. Someone would call up the local Bureau of Indian Affairs, and an amount would be proposed. They'd strike a deal. Then, starting in the 1970s, a new framework was created where tribes did the negotiations and demanded more. Still, the deals were transactional, selling of a valuable natural resource without regard to long-term prospects or the values of a community. Is there a better way? On Indigenous Peoples Day, a new investor's guide was released that proposed a framework that incorporates Indigenous values. The Sustainable Indigenous Finance Navigating the Energy Transition report does just that. It's a plan, a tool. It helps tribes assess and mitigate financial risks tied to the energy transition. The goal is to make sure that the investments align with Indigenous communities. The report says Indigenous people and local communities steward about 50% of all global land, including 54% of intact forests and over 40% of key biodiversity areas, including vital watersheds, all with vast mineral resources. The research suggests over half of global energy transition mineral and mining projects, including 85% of lithium and 75% of manganese deposits, overlap with Indigenous territories. Yet companies often overlook that impact on the operations on Indigenous population, and that leads to conflict and business risks like supply chain disruption or legal challenges. Around the world, governments and companies are switching from fossil fuels to green energy, and that requires a lot of minerals, and so many of those projects are on Indigenous lands. What happens to companies that ignore that fact? That's what's interesting about the role of investors, because the cost goes up and on-site disruption. Think Standing Rock can increase the cost of a project by 500%. One real-world example we can talk about shortly is Rio Tinto Copper and its Arizona copper mine. It's in a place that's considered sacred to the San Carlos Apache tribe. You've probably heard a lot about President Trump's hostility to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and just about any program related to climate change. But the takeaway from this report is that the government is not the only player. Investors have money at stake, and that means a different framework. I have probably known Rebecca Adamson for, I hate to say it, but 40 years. She's an economist, and one of the things she's been working on is kind of finding common ground in the concentric circles of values from Indigenous communities, the economy, and the investment world. And she's founder of First Peoples Worldwide, and I'm happy to welcome Rebecca Adamson.
Thank you. I'm thrilled to be here, Mark. And we're all gray now, but that's wisdom, I guess.
Yeah, I'm still not sure about that part of it.
I'm waiting for it.
This report that came out from Sustainable Investors Forum is really remarkable in a lot of ways, but it's stuff we've talked about for years. But what this does is put this into a guidebook that's really practical that people can use. So maybe talk about your takeaway from the report, Rebecca.
Admittedly, it was a heavy lift. It was really inspiring but challenging to mix the finance language in with Indigenous priorities and to carry the evidence-based research that upheld sort of the findings. I think the key takeaway is we did it. We were able to use AI, or artificial intelligence, the AI-driven analytics that was, for the first time ever, Mark, able to link a company's financial performance directly to their behavior and impact on Indigenous lands. This was a major breakthrough. Working with Wharton, we had the first quantification approach in looking at risk and what that translates into by way of financial terms, costs and benefits and material losses. We had this vast data sets that we moved around in the grid, but we came up with the direct foreign investments, or actually just sort of any investment going on to Indigenous lands, increases risk by 500%. we didn't find a single investor that charged a premium for that level of risk. So that's a huge finding for investors' self-interest to do this right. The second finding was that these monies going on to indigenous lands lead 9 violent events per year from the investment. So we're looking at high risk coming out of the conflict that money causes when it comes in the wrong way. And that was the key finding. There is a right way. And the right way is embedding tribes and indigenous people in the decision making from the beginning and identification of the project all the way through production and implementation and operations. That was a huge finding that we could prove it financially in what it costs not to do it the right way.
And that's the thing where we have this perception of government being all powerful, but you can't wish away some of this stuff. That no matter what you say over and over, the facts on the ground are the facts on the ground. And if you're not involving a Native community, you're putting your investors at risk.
You know, you're speaking to the choir here, because you and I used to talk about this, and we used to talk about this can't be good. And DAPL proved it out beyond a question and really started driving the investigation into it. But we're seeing now there's the self-interest where these risks or the cost of the risks are being absorbed by the investor. They're spread across the company operations in a way investors don't know how much were lost. So they are absorbing this. And that's the market reality you're talking about. The market reality in a big sense, just think about it from Trump says fossil fuels are the game changer and we've got to focus on fossil fuels. Solar energy has outperformed in the market, more gross profit and more sales, the whole piece that you look for, and proven it outperforms fossil fuels. You also look at situations where, well, here's one that we uncovered. When we were doing the guidebook, we were meeting with private rating agencies, and they basically are the ones that give these investors 1 star to 5 stars, and everybody wants that 5-star rating. So these are the guys right at the front gate of performance. And what they were telling us was that when Trump came into office first time around, and he, just expedited permits, deregulated the industries, that's not the issue. The issue is risk. They said, you've got to focus on risk. Market cares about risk. You can do it faster, but you can also have more risk in doing it faster. And they were seeing actual outcomes where the risk was higher because of the lack of the front-loaded right way of doing this stuff. So the market, there is clearly pressure, governmental pressure. Look, for how long has government been trying to exploit us in the market? Forever. So it's nothing new that we're looking at or experiencing in this administration. It could be uglier, but the extractive drive has always been assisted by the government policy. And so for the first time ever, we're like, forget the government, forget the company. Let's look at returns and let's make the financial return the driver. And it will. The word has to get out. We're far away from getting the word out and getting at the headwaters of investors. But one of the things that's happening, and you followed this, the energy transition, the urgency to get our energy economy going. I would imagine you've watched the amount of deposits on indigenous lands that really are driving. 54% of the essential minerals are located for essential minerals to make this transition are located on indigenous land. The United States, the tribes are really facing this.
No, it's across the board. And whether it's copper or lithium, you can go down the list of essential minerals. In fact, one of the things that a former CEO of one of the Rio Tinto companies told me was that we have to mine more copper than in the entire history of the world to keep up with energy transition. And he was talking about AI as much as energy, but that's just staggering when you think about it.
You've had personal experience with a couple of these companies. They're predicting that overall there's got to be a 600% increase in the energy outputs, the transition mineral outputs, to meet the energy transition needs. Now, when you look at how that happens, this brings up another key point in our findings. Was you look at the big institutional investors who really construct their portfolio for long-term value. And what we're finding is if you erode that long-term value, that's it. So the protests, work stoppage, all these things lead to what's called stranded assets. And when stranded assets take place, there's no recoup on long-term value. It just disappears out of the portfolio completely. So the fiduciary duty tied to long-term value creation and protection came out really clearer than ever before. So we're looking at the institutional investors, we're looking at the impact, the environmental, the ESG investors, all being held to this new finding within their fiduciary duty and how they manage their portfolios. The other issue is, how much biodiversity and land globally that's indigenous. 80% of the biodiversity on about half of the land's surface are indigenous lands and territories and stewarded resources and ecosystems. Well, when you start looking at this, an investor looks at their portfolio as individual investments. But let's take Montana, an agricultural state with 62% of its industry being agricultural. Water comes into play. They predict that there's going to be no change in investments in Montana. There were 10,000 tribal water claims up there. Then you factor in climate change, precipitation, drought, floods, and you have a direct impact on agriculture, but it's a correlated risk because it comes through tribal rights and water, the environment. So the access to that risk is through the environment and through tribal rights, which are the social rights, and it's not in the portfolios at all right now. They cannot handle the correlated risk. And the report points to this. The report really models indigenous people's decision-making in a way that understands these correlated risks, that look to long-term value. It's a groundbreaker.